Let me first tell you how much the insurance industry has been shocked and saddened by what has happened in Paris. And I would like to stress that our thoughts have been with the Parisians, with the whole French people, and with the firefighters who have very courageously been fighting this terrible fire all night long. So you raised the question of insurance. Well, typically in most countries, such historical monuments are difficult to insure just because the sums insured would be too big for any insurance company to be able to provide coverage for such monuments.
But it's not impossible, is it, to insure something on that grand scale?
Well, I suppose it would be the sums insured would be, it's not impossible. The sums insured would be much less than the actual damage that would take place. But of course, it depends on the owner of the monument. Sometimes these are local constituencies, such as municipalities. Sometimes these are ministries of cultures. This would be the case for Notre Dame. But it depends really on the coverage and the risk management strategy of those different constituencies to decide what's the appropriate coverage. So it's not impossible, but what we see in practice is that a very small proportion of these monuments are being indeed covered by insurance.
Okay, so how do they pay then for the restoration of something like this? And I mean, we had our own incident with the Kapelbruch in Lucerne some 25 years ago. That was restored. Is there any lessons to be learned? I mean...
So it typically, since those monuments in most cases are publicly owned by a public constituencies, it would be public money, so taxpayers' money that would cover it for the reconstruction of such an event. The French President Macron announced the launch of a major subscription, an international subscription, to help cover parts of the costs of the refurbishing of Notre Dame, the reconstruction of Notre Dame. Of course, any public constituency would have every year a given amount for maintenance of such events, but putting aside enough money to cover such a large event would be very difficult for public finances.
And as the Geneva Association, I mean, you guide policy and regulation on risk management. I mean, what would you be telling authorities in France to safeguard in the future?
So I would tell authorities, not only in France, but really in all countries where there are such important historical monuments. We have to remind that Notre Dame de Paris is part of the Paris Seine Bank's World Heritage Site. So the recommendation would be two things. Number one, to build awareness of the vulnerability of those sites, which often are very old, have not been necessarily well maintained. And so it's build awareness. And the second thing that as an industry, we can say to governments, public institutions, is that it's possible to work on risk prevention practices. The insurance industry, most large insurance companies have risk engineering, risk prevention units who have an advisory role in terms of making recommendations in order to diminish the probability of such a terrible event, and if it still occurs, to diminish the severity of such an event. And so my recommendation would be to very much engage with those risk prevention units of large insurance companies to work on those risk prevention plans.
And just very briefly, if you wanted to kind of maximize your insurance coverage, you said, obviously, these things are far too huge to be covered to their maximum value. But what about benefiting from other things like catastrophe bonds, for example?
Well, catastrophe bonds are a new tool to cover risks. As their name says, they are meant to cover natural catastrophes, and we have seen more and more of these in the past few years. We are not aware of catastrophe bonds specifically dedicated for historical monuments, but I think it's part of the research that the industry can look into to provide coverage for such historical sites.